So the goals of the Web Accessibility Framework is sustainable web accessibility, which I throw in compliance there because sometimes that's the frame of mind people have to start. But we find if you achieve web accessibility, you'll achieve compliance. And you kind of know where to start, understand what a mature web accessibility strategy might look like, and then know specific outcomes that lead to accessibility. And need to be something flexible for any org. So that large university with all those departments to an e-commerce company or a single one of the departments in a university, right? It needs to be flexible. And the Web Accessibility Framework, we'll talk more about how it's created at the very end, but it is an open source community resource. So it's something that anyone can get feedback on and can evolve over time. So with that, let's jump into the framework. The framework consists of 3 parts. There's the core, tiers, and profile. And the core is kind of a list of desired accessibility outcomes. And each of these can be customized. So we'll get into that. But the core is it's kind of a list of accessibility outcomes. Profiles is an alignment of your organization's requirements and objectives and kind of where you're at and where you want to go. And we'll dive into each of these. Implementation tiers is more like high level what people think of when they think of like a maturity model. So it's a qualitative measure of kind of where you're at. And you can just use parts of these. So on the screen, there was a circle graph, like a pie graph with 3 sections with core, tiers, and profile, and web accessibility framework going through the middle. So on this slide, we're jumping into core, and there is a circle pie graph with 5 equal sections, and it starts with identify, then prevent, detect, respond, and remediate. So these are the 5 core functions. So right now we're just talking about the core part of the framework. And the core describes desired outcomes, like I mentioned. The goal is that they're really self-explanatory for the most part, understandable by everyone as much as possible. And it can apply to any type of digital asset. And if you think about it, this defines the entire breadth of web accessibility. So all the different activities can kind of fit in one of these 5 functions. And it's looking at both prevention and reaction. It also is outcome driven. So it doesn't say how to achieve them because your organization's strengths and weaknesses and goals and risk appetite and all that can be different. But it's focusing on specific outcomes. And it is a circle because it is ongoing, right? Accessibility is never completed. We don't, it's not something we can just check off and forget about. So it builds over time. And so each function has categories and subcategories. And I'll pull up a spreadsheet and show you how this works. But an example is in the function of prevent, a category is awareness and training. And then a subcategory or outcome is all users are informed and trained according to their role. And even if you think about it, just that one outcome could have a very big impact in the accessibility on a team or or department or whatever it is that you're looking at. And not every org needs to use all the subcategories, so you can adapt it to your org. The subcategories are descriptive, so they're not prescriptive. They don't tell you exactly how to do it. So in this example, it doesn't tell you how to make sure all users are informed, but that is the desired outcome. But let's take a simple scenario with the core of the framework. So we have our 5 core functions of identify, prevent, detect, respond, and remediate. And we went through and picked one outcome from each. So for identify, the one outcome we picked to focus on is identify critical or higher priority user paths. So we're going to think through, like for an e-commerce site, we want to make sure that when that they can buy something, they can add something to the cart and buy it. That's probably our critical flow, our number one typically on e-commerce. And maybe in higher ed, depending on which user we're looking at, there could be different ones, but make sure they can apply. Make sure, a student can, understand it to take the quiz or whatever it is, right? So we're going to identify critical or higher priority user paths. For prevent, all users are informed and trained according to their role. We already talked about that a little bit. Detect, automated testing is scheduled on a regular cadence. And another one could be manual testing, but in this example, we're picking one to start with. Respond, detected issues are documented and logged in a central system along with non-accessibility issues. And then remediate, issues are remediated regularly. If you start to think about it, just by picking one outcome from each, we could start to have, some impact. I also like this example because in just a few minutes, I can effectively communicate that web accessibility cannot be achieved by just installing some JavaScript, or it's not something that's checked off. So I can start having a discussion, and people also can realize pretty quickly that it's an ongoing thing, and there's maybe more activities related to it than they had previously envisioned. So we have a version of this slide in all of our sales decks. So anytime we're talking to someone, we want them to, kind of understand that web accessibility isn't just, buy our product or do one specific thing. Like there's a little more to it, and to kind of think big picture. So with that, I'm going to pull open the core and do just a little demo. And we are going to get, so just to Chrome. So I just left the presentation. I went to the Chrome browser, and I'm just going to Google Web Accessibility Framework. Just search Web Accessibility Framework, should come up pretty high. So right here. And on here, we're on the Pope Tech website with the Web Accessibility Framework, and it goes over the different sections. It kind of gives an outline of core, tiers, profile. I'm going to drill into core section, and this kind of goes over it a bit. And I'm going to go down to, there's some different examples, but there's this core outcome list. So this is a Google Sheet. So I'm going to open this in a new tab. And this has a set of outcomes. And so we have a spreadsheet with different outcomes. As of now, there's 51 outcomes. As I mentioned, this is open source. So there certainly are more outcomes that in the future will be added to this, I'm sure. But as of now, there's 51 different accessibility outcomes. I'm going to zoom in a bit. I know it's a little small. And let's get rid of my header up there and take up our space. So we'll go through a few different examples to get the idea. So of that core function of identify, we have categories of asset management, business environment, and governance and risk management. So under asset management, there's things like we actually know what websites we have. In bigger organizations, this can be, a real challenge, like just to even know what you have. But it's pretty hard to set a clear goal of fixing things and what it really is going to take if you just don't even know what you have. It's hard to even set a goal of testing them. And so that can be important. And other things of like, what are those key user flows? Make sure you think of employee-facing websites, not just the public ones, or things behind a login. What other types of digital assets do we have? Do we have, documents, videos, potentially other things like kiosks or whatever it is. So what types of digital assets do we have? Do we know, so accessibility roles and responsibilities for the entire workforce and third-party stakeholders are established. So this kind of goes, someone was saying multiple teams working together. Maybe there's existing roles tied into HR that there can be some accessibility responsibilities as part of those. And so it's just kind of looking through this on different, like what do you have? Let's inventory where we're at. And then do you have, for example, under business environment, so what's your role in the supply chain? Maybe you're selling software that's used by government or higher ed that have specific, additional laws, things that you should consider. And your impact on what you're doing kind of affects other people that you work with in your business environment. So what's your role? Or, with the pandemic, there was lots of people providing things that potentially caused barriers where users couldn't access important health and safety information. And some of that was from third-party downstream things. Other things could be, so under governance and risk, just understanding the legal and regulatory requirements regarding web accessibility, that they're understood and managed. Organization accessibility policy is established and communicated, so having a clear policy. And if this feels overwhelming, that's okay. You can just start with one of each, and we'll talk more about that. So don't get overwhelmed, but it hopefully gives a list of outcomes that kind of help realize things that you could do and realize opportunities, and again, leverage your wins and what you're good at. Risk tolerance is defined as an interesting one because, well, we should be accessible, but as an organization, we're either explicitly or implicitly saying where we're at. And sometimes it's good to come out and say, like, this is where we're at, because then we can decide to improve it over time and make a conscious decision. So under prevent, there's categories of awareness and training, change management process, and procurement. So we can prevent a lot of accessibility issues by training. And that includes both the web accessibility personnel, senior executives, and all users. So even if people who are just creating emails or social media posts or blog posts or whatever it is, any digital content, learning just a few principles that tie to their role. Change management, instead of just fixing it in production, can we embed accessibility into existing processes as changes happen? And there's different outcomes in there. Procurement, yeah, are we considering web accessibility when you're buying that little plugin to put on your website or whatever it is? Because that can be obviously a real gotcha. And under detect, the categories are sampling, manual testing, automated testing, user feedback. And so we're not just relying on one form of detecting issues. If a user tells you there's an issue, that's like, that's gold. Obviously it's a problem, but that's gold for improving your accessibility. You need to act on that, make that high priority. Sampling can be really useful, but we did a whole blog article just on ideas on sample methods, because you can use sampling to really have a cost-effective detection strategy. And you can do it at any budget. Obviously, if you increase your budget, it might be a little more robust, but you can start at any budget using just free tools. Function of respond would have categories of response planning, documentation and prioritization, communication. So, hey, we've detected issues, we know where we're at, but now what do we do with that? And having a clear plan for how you document and prioritize. So for example, user feedback is initially considered high priority unless analysis changes priority. So that you take that user feedback seriously. All the issues are documented and prioritized. And I like this one. So detected issues or groups of issues are documented and logged in a central system along with non-accessibility issues. We find if you treat accessibility totally separate, then it just gets deprioritized. And so if you treat it just like any other, bug or issue based on the impact, right? So some are higher, medium, low, but if you put it in there as part of your existing flow, find it's more effective in the long run. And then how do you communicate when you do have issues? And then remediate. It doesn't do a lot of good to detect all the issues if you don't fix them, right? And so we need to fix issues. And I really like under remediate, there's categories of accessibility issues, processes, and reputation. And under processes, actually analyze what caused this issue to happen. And then let's actually fix the process rather than just fix the issue. And so hopefully this kind of gives an idea that going through this could help an organization see maybe some gaps and maybe kind of where to get started. But you do have to be just careful you don't get overwhelmed, right? So let me go back, and we'll come back a little bit to this, but with a little different spin. So that's how the core works. And now we have that same pie graph with core, tiers, and profile on the screen, and we're going to talk about profiles. And so a profile is where are you at today? That'd be your current profile. Where do you want to be tomorrow? That's your target profile. And what do you need to get to your target? That's a gap analysis. So what's our gap? What's it going to take to get there? I think it's important to not just say our target profile is perfection. That's not really useful. That can be, but for this, I think it's useful to think of the next target profile, like what's kind of our next goal of what we're going to do. And I'll give one example of how that could be done here in a minute. But it's also useful to answer like, what's the priority? So yes, we're lacking. There's a gap on here. 2, there's a ton of resources needed for this specific one, and the priority is low. So maybe we're going to take something that needs less resources with a higher priority and start there first. Because if everything's high priority, then nothing's high priority. So you need a little, prioritization. And then, yeah, that final one's how will funding and resources be used? And then do we need additional funding and resources? So I'm gonna kind of pop back to the spreadsheet. And what I did is from that Google sheet, I just went file, make a copy. And so again, this is all like open source. Take it, use it. So I made a copy. And now I'm in this new tab of the copy that I made. I'm going to just slide that over for a minute. So we have the original function, category, subcategories, and I've added some profiles. But real quick before we get that, I just want to show maybe how you could simplify this. So I open a new tab, and here I've taken those original outcomes and taken just a few from each category. So for asset management, I just want to know my public facing websites and pages are inventory. That's like where I'm at as an organization. That's how I'm going to start today. And so I've just started small, and you could even go, simpler if you wanted, like we mentioned, just one each, or it could be a few, or it could be somewhere in the middle. Maybe I add a custom outcome that, and if you do add custom outcomes, feel free to share it back with the community. But yeah, you can adapt this to what makes sense for your org. So yeah, let's go back to this first one, and I'll slide this back. And so over here, these profile statuses, this is in no means like this is how you should do it. I just spent 10 minutes coming up with an example. You could, like this example of implemented, undefined, that was just one way of looking at it. But the idea is, where are you at today? Where do you want to be tomorrow? What's the gap? What resources are needed? What's the priority? And how you organize that probably is going to be different for most orgs. And you might already have ways to do things like that. But in this case, so I took for the function of identity and the outcome of public facing websites and pages or inventory, our profile in this case is implemented, targets implemented. So awesome, we don't have a gap analysis. But now websites, pages, and flows behind logins are inventoried. That's undefined. The target profile is planned. So what's our gap analysis? Well, so far in this org, the focus has been on external, no efforts on employee websites to date, which can be pretty common. And so we set a timeline of 6 months, some required resources. In this case, they have additional teams, so no additional funding required, high priority. By going through this, though, it gives you a way to talk with leadership as well, and a way to communicate, know where you're at and communicate it. And so that can be really useful. And so we could go through and do this. Now that might seem complicated. So in this next tab, we took a simplified, again, it's the simplified number of outcomes, and we went through and okay, that seems a little more approachable, but you also could simplify profiles. This third tab, simplified profiles, instead of doing a profile for each outcome, I only did a profile for the entire function. So you could just do a profile for the category, for an outcome, for a function. You also could do it for a team, a product, or a department, right? So you can kind of layer this how it makes sense. But now you can look at, where am I at today? What's my target? What's the gap? And timeline, goals, priority, and kind of work through that. So And again, this is just one example. So don't get too caught up in it, but if it's useful for you to start and to think, then, have at it. So as a comment, this is a great foundation. Love to hear it. Another one, that planning and analysis worksheet is super helpful. Awesome. So let's now, I'm going to pop back to my presentation. And now we're going to talk about the third section of that original pie graph. So we had our core, our profile, and tiers. And this is, again, more what, if you're familiar with like a maturity model, a lot of the maturity models kind of start with what this is called tiers and then work down, and they do get into some prescriptive things, or potentially just some of them get too prescriptive is one of the reasons we didn't just use them. But they do get into descriptive like outcomes sometimes, but it's a little different way of thinking about it. But here we have tiers. So at the bottom is our partial tier. So we on the screen, there's kind of like a pyramid with 4 layers. So the bottom layer is partial, the second's risk informed, third is repeatable, 4 is adaptable. And we'll go over each of those. So partial is that bottom tier. So this would be an organization with on-demand or no web accessibility procedure. So maybe you're here right now, or every org at some point was here, right? Organizations in tier 1 are categorized as having very little awareness of web accessibility risk. Someone had mentioned that at the beginning, one of the challenges. They frequently fail to prioritize web accessibility measures properly. So there's a lack of prioritization, a lack of awareness. So that's kind of, at the bottom. So tier 2 is risk informed. Although tier 2 organizations have a fair amount of knowledge, they often lack a coordinated strategy, and they don't have uniform policies across departments. So there might be silos of knowledge. There might be silos of people working on accessibility, but it's not really uniform. Or potentially there's people who care, but they don't have the authority. We don't have leadership buy-in. And so it's kind of a little bit of a hard place to live, and really grinds on the accessibility professionals who are kind of stuck in there, or the accessibility champions, whatever the case is. So tier 3 is repeatable. And so this is organizations that follow web accessibility best practices and have received executive approval. And they're often, equipped to deal with detected issues, potential barriers. So this is really, above average and kind of a great place to be. You're able to consistently, meet accessibility standards. Tier 4 is adaptive. This is the topmost tier, and this does require the most time and money or resources. And it consists of organizations that are trained and adaptive to prevent accessibility issues and respond to barriers even beyond accessibility standards. So you're prepared to accommodate a wide range of user disabilities and accommodation requests. So for example, when WCAG 2.2 came out, and it's talking about CAPTCHA or different things like that, these orgs have already considered those, even though there wasn't a WCAG standard for some of it, because they're thinking about accessibility and they're trying to prevent issues and make it easy, to use. Not every org, when we're talking about like profiles, a profile also could be, hey, currently we are repeatable and we want to be adaptive. But again, don't always start with we want to be adaptive if you're just at tier 1, if that's not realistic, because that will just be frustrating and isn't a great way to make organization changes, right? These things can also be, so the tiers can also be used like for your entire org or a specific department or a product or a team. And so it's just very flexible. And they can be a great way to have conversations. So the entire framework's customizable for your org. I've said that a lot, but I just want to kind of make sure that gets through. You can use only the core or part of the core. You can add some more outcomes, right? So if you're in higher ed, maybe on where there was talking about employee focus. So the framework's meant to be really industry agnostic, but you could add some student focused ones. So maybe a few related outcomes, just kind of based on the existing ones, but for students or your learning management system content. You could have simple or in-depth profiles. and then tiers could be changed for what makes sense. So one question or comment, I guess, is how to measure compliance with accessibility policy over all of university and all the university digital content. So public-facing websites, Canvas sites, etc. So how do you measure compliance? So I'm going to touch base on some ideas on that here in just a second. So that's a great comment. Don't chase, this is me, you can disagree with it, but don't chase perfection at the expense of progress. So I think it's just useful to start small and build on it. Once we had an annual check-in with this university, and every year they'd say they're waiting for their policy to be finalized. And we did this for 4 years and they never moved. And I think if you can't get that policy finalized in 4 years, like you can start being a little more creative and start moving smaller. And so that's just a suggestion of progress over perfection, because that, and that's one of the reasons the framework's the circle, it's always ongoing. So here's a potential getting started strategy, and I'll come back to that comment of universities. So one way to get started with this is you identify an org strength and look for one outcome from each core function that will be impactful and build on each other. So maybe your org has a mission to, or is really good at public perception. So maybe you can kind of leverage into that, the importance of accessibility, or they have a mission that lines up with accessibility, or you're just really good at QA. You have an awesome QA team. Okay, well, let's embed accessibility into that and look at the outcomes that kind of match. And so I think by piggybacking off of wins, you can get momentum quicker and be effective. For training, the whole reason we created the monthly accessibility focus articles, you might have seen them, was thinking through like this framework. We just wanted more training resources. So you have permission to take those articles on our blog and adapt them. Maybe just link back to them and give attribution, but take them and use them in your own content. Send them in, email newsletters or whatever the case may be. So we just want to, provide a resource, so that can be useful. But let's get into some more kind of real world, and this will go back to that comment before. So here's a few ideas. So with tiers, one, and this is based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so one of the strategies I saw in that framework is a university actually created a survey on the tiers, and they sent it. So they identified someone responsible in each group, and they sent it to them. And then the accessibility team selectively sampled the questions to verify. And that was a way to measure. So kind of going back to Eva's comment, that was a way to measure accessibility one way, right? And if you look at a lot of those outcomes, I think there's a lot of potential for measuring throughout. Some of them will take more effort than others, but that was one that I saw that was useful. Another strategy is to use the profiles to have conversations with leadership to get more funding. So if you're an accessibility champion, you can say, here's where we're at. Here's, like our goal. This is what it would take to get there. And then somebody has to say yes or no. And that can be powerful, because if they say no, they have to really think about that. And then, obviously you tried. And so you've got some leverage there, but a lot of times you can get them to say yes by saying, hey, we have this policy, we're not meeting it. Here's our gap analysis. Here's what it would take to do it. You're using decision makers' language at them. It's also similar to the way they think with security. So sometimes you can piggyback. If you have a good security program, sometimes you can use some of those wins as well. Another idea is if you can get accessibility into regular leadership meetings, can be really useful. A couple things I heard at CSUN. I just got back from the CSUN Accessibility Conference. USU, Christopher Phillips, he was talking about captioning. And one of the things he said is make the problem bigger until someone cares. And he was successfully able to do that. So they drew a line in the sand and said, after this date, they create a policy, got leadership buy-in. After this date, all videos have to be captioned. They got additional funding, they changed the process, they used automated manual testing together, and they created training resources. And it's been very, successful for them. And so I like that. Sometimes you just got to make the problem bigger. So talk about it in a way where everyone sees it until someone cares. Another one I saw was Northwestern University. Jim gave a presentation at CSUN about they were able to get leadership buy-in, create an accessibility policy. This is talking about Canvas LMS. They added some tools in the creation process. They created a mission accessible program that had training. Like the one thing I really liked about this is they looked for teams that would be the most likely to adopt and focus their training there. And then anybody who met certain criteria were champions. And then they'd email the dean, CC the person, and they saw, a significant decrease in detectable issues. And so that was something measurable they were able to see because it came from a clear goal at the beginning.